Broken and bleeding, the Talarian fleet drifted in the void of space, flames licking from ruptured hulls as the brutal Cranax warships closed in for the kill. I sat hunched over the grimy bar, nursing a glass of something strong enough to strip paint from a starship's hull. The dim lights of the space station cast more shadows than illumination, but I preferred it that way. Fewer people asked questions when they couldn't get a good look at you. A flutter of feathers caught my attention as a young Talarian soldier slid onto the stool next to me. His plumage was ruffled, eyes wide with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Excuse me, sir, but are you Paul Ross, the human who fought in the Battle of Zephyrus, the one who turned the tide against the Cranax?" I glanced up, meeting his gaze with a nod. That's me, but it wasn't just me out there. All of humanity stood against the Cranax that day. The soldier leaned in eagerly. "I'm Corvus. I've heard the stories, but I want to know the truth. How did you do it? How did humanity win against such impossible odds?" Memories flooded back vivid and raw. I took a long pull from my drink before setting it down. "All right, lad, I'll tell you. But to understand what happened at Zephyrus, you need to know what led up to it." Settling back, I let my mind drift to those dark days. When the Cranax first invaded Talarian space, your people fought with everything you had. But the Cranax were relentless. They had the numbers, the tech, and a hunger for conquest that couldn't be stopped. They swallowed system after system, and it looked like nothing in the galaxy could keep them from the heart of your Federation. Corvus nodded, his feathers drooping. "Zephyrus Prime, our homeworld and last stronghold." "Exactly. The Cranax wanted Zephyrus, and they were ready to crush anyone who got in their way. Your fleet was being torn apart, and it seemed like only a matter of time before the Cranax landed on your homeworld soil." I paused, the weight of those days heavy on my shoulders. That's when humanity stepped in. We couldn't watch your people face annihilation, but even with our help, the odds were stacked against us. The Cranax outnumbered our combined forces 10-1, in ships, soldiers, and raw firepower. Corvus leaned forward, hanging on every word. "But you still fought, even though it seemed hopeless." "We did." I closed my eyes for a moment, the echoes of battle filling my mind. Because sometimes when the stakes are high enough, you have to stand and fight. Even if it looks like a losing battle. Even if it means laying down your life. Because some things are worth dying for. Opening my eyes, I fixed Corvus with a stare. That's what we did at Zephyrus. We fought with everything we had, knowing that if we failed, the Talarian people would be wiped out, and the Cranax would turn their sights on humanity next. It was a battle for survival, not just for your people, but for all of us. I took a moment, the memories of those desperate times flooding back. The weight of the galaxy had been on our shoulders. I met Corvus's gaze, seeing the rapt attention in his eyes, eager to hear what happened next. The Talarians were on the brink. They'd lost over half their territory to the Cranax war machine, their once mighty fleet reduced to a shadow of itself, smashed apart in battle after battle. I shook my head, remembering the grim reports that had crossed my desk. They sent out a distress call, begging for help from anyone who would listen, but few answered. The other species, they were too scared of the Cranax to stick their necks out. A faint smile tugged at my lips. Except humanity. We knew firsthand how vicious the Cranax could be, had our own scars from tangling with them in the past. So when we heard about the Talarians' plight, about how close they were to being wiped out completely, we couldn't just sit back and watch it happen. I leaned forward, my voice low and intense. But we weren't stupid. The Cranax had us outgunned and outnumbered 3-1, and their tech made ours look like we were throwing rocks. A straight-up fight would have been suicide. A grin spread across my face. So we got creative. While the Talarians and what few allies had the guts to join them gathered their forces at Zephyrus Prime, prepared to make their final stand, we got to work. Quietly assembled a secret fleet, hiding it in the Hadrian system right under the Cranax's nose. I chuckled. It was made up of our most advanced ships, ones with cloaking tech that made them damn near invisible, along with some new weapons the R&D boys had cooked up. I paused, taking a swig of my drink, feeling the burn as it went down. The plan was deceptively simple, incredibly risky, but it was the best shot we had. The Talarians and the Allied fleet would take on the Cranax head-on, make as much noise as possible, draw them into a massive brawl over Zephyrus Prime. While they were occupied with that, our hidden fleet would sneak in the back, go after their command ships, hit their supply lines, basically sow as much chaos and confusion as we could behind the lines. Corvus sat wide-eyed, hanging on my every word as I recounted the Battle of Zephyrus. The Cranax were so focused on the main fight, so dead set on smashing through the Talarian lines, that they never saw us coming. They took our bait hook, line, and sinker. I closed my eyes for a moment, the memories of that fateful day rushing back. The Allied fleet fought like demons, Corvus. They were outmatched in every way, but they didn't give an inch. Talarian, human, Zoraxian, they all bled together, holding the line against wave after wave of Cranax ships. My hands clenched into fists as I recalled the brutal fighting, but it wasn't enough. The Cranax just kept coming, throwing more ships into the meat grinder. Our allies were being torn apart, their numbers dwindling by the minute. It looked like the end. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. I was on the bridge of the TFS Valiant, watching it all unfold. Every fibre of my being wanted to charge in, to help our friends, but we had to wait. We had to let the Cranax commit everything they had. Corvus was on the edge of his seat, his feathers quivering with anticipation. What happened next? A slow grin spread across my face. We got the signal. The Cranax had overextended, leaving their rear exposed. It was time to strike. I slammed my fist on the table, making Corvus jump. We decloaked right on top of their supply train, so close I could see the shocked looks on the Cranax commanders' faces. They never expected an attack from behind. My eyes gleamed as I relived that glorious moment. We hit them with everything we had. Nova bombs, phase torpedoes, kinetic strikes. We targeted their fuel depots first, then their repair yards, anything that could keep their war machine running. I laughed, a harsh bark in the quiet bar. The explosions lit up the sky, Corvus. A second sun born from the heart of their own supply lines. You could see it from the surface of Zephyrus Prime, a bright flash that signaled the turning of the tide. I let that sink in for a moment, watching the shock and awe play across Corvus's face. The Cranax had been thrown into utter chaos, their once fearsome war machine crumbling under our assault. But we didn't pause to celebrate. We kept up the pressure, striking hard and fast at their disoriented forces. I grinned, remembering the fierce exhilaration of those moments. We hit their combat ships with targeted EMP bursts, frying their systems and leaving them dead in space. Then we sent in the boarding parties to mop up the crews and secure the vessels. My expression turned serious as I continued. That's where I came in. I led a team of Marines onto the Keys Invictus, one of their mightiest dreadnoughts. Our objective was to seize control of the bridge and neutralize its weapon systems. I closed my eyes for a moment, the memories of that brutal fight still vivid. It was intense, Corvus. Room to room, corridor to corridor. The Cranax were elite soldiers, and they didn't give up easy. We had to pry every inch of that ship from their claws. My voice grew heavy with the weight of loss. We paid a steep price. I lost a lot of good soldiers that day, friends, brothers and sisters in arms. I paused, letting the pain wash over me before pushing it aside. But we did it. We took the bridge and shut down the Invictus guns, cut the head off the beast, so to speak. I leaned back, draining the last of my drink. And that's when things got really interesting. I fixed Corvus with the intense stare, my voice low and urgent. While we were securing the ship, combing through its databanks, we found something. A set of coordinates hidden deep in the Cranax files. It took some decrypting, but when we finally cracked it, we couldn't believe what we'd stumbled onto. I leaned in closer, as if sharing a secret. Those coordinates, Corvus, they led to a hidden Cranax base, but not just any base. It was their primary cloning facility, the heart of their war machine, the place where they bred their soldiers and grew their war beasts. Corvus' eyes widened, his beak dropping open in shock. A secret cloning facility. That's how those Cranax scum were able to field such a massive army so quickly. I nodded grimly, my jaw tightening. Exactly. As long as that damn facility was operational, the Cranax could replace their losses and keep fighting indefinitely. We knew we had to take it out. It was the only way to end this war. I took another swig of my drink, the burn helping to steady my nerves as I continued. We relayed the information to the Allied fleet and the Talarian High Command. They all agreed that destroying the cloning facility was our top priority. But there was a problem. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth, a glint of pride in my eye. That's when we came up with Operation Trojan Horse. We would use the captured Cranax dreadnought, the Invictus, to infiltrate the base. With its transponder codes and Cranax crew still aboard, it would be able to pass through the defenses without raising suspicion. My expression turned serious as I met Corvus's gaze. But for the plan to work, we needed a crew that could pass as Cranax. That's where I came in. I underwent extensive genetic and cybernetic modifications to make me look and sound like a Cranax warrior. It was a painful and risky process, but it was our only chance. I grimaced, remembering the agony of the transformation. The bone restructuring, the dermal implants, the vocal cord alterations. It had felt like being torn apart and put back together as something alien and wrong. But it was necessary. The fate of the Talarian people, of all free species in the galaxy, rested on the success of this mission. Corvus leaned forward, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and revulsion. What happened next? Did the plan work? I barked out a harsh laugh. Oh, it worked all right, but not without a few sin complications. You see, infiltrating a secret Cranax base is one thing. Doing it while trying to keep a crew of real Cranax warriors in line, that's another challenge entirely. My eyes took on a faraway look as I delved back into the memories. The tension on the bridge of the Invictus had been thicker than the armor plating. One wrong move, one suspicious glance from the Cranax crew, and the whole operation would have been blown. We had to play our parts perfectly. Any slip-up, any hint that we weren't who we claimed to be, and we'd have been dead before we could blink. It was like walking on a razor's edge, with the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. I shook my head, marveling at the audacity of the plan. But somehow, through a combination of luck, skill, and sheer bloody-minded determination, we pulled it off. The Invictus glided through the defenses like a ghost, the sensor arrays and minefields recognizing it as one of their own. Corvus was on the edge of his seat, his talons digging into the bar. And then, what did you find inside the base? I met his gaze, my expression grim. What we found inside, it was worse than we could have imagined. Row after row of cloning tanks, each one filled with a growing Cranax warrior. And the breeding pits. I still have nightmares about the things we saw in there. I drained the last of my drink, slamming the glass down on the bar. But that's a story for another time. What matters is that we planted the charges, set the timers, and got the hell out of there. And when those bombs went off... A savage grin spread across my face. It was like the wrath of the gods, Corvus. The entire base went up in a fireball that could be seen from orbit, the heart of the Cranax war machine, reduced to ashes in an instant. I leaned back, the weight of the memories heavy on my shoulders. That was the turning point. With their cloning facility destroyed and their supply lines in ruins, the Cranax were on the back foot. It was only a matter of time before they were pushed back, their conquest undone by their own hubris and the tenacity of those who stood against them. The Battle of Zephyrus had been a defining moment, not just for the Talarians but for all of us. It had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, victory was possible, that when the free peoples of the galaxy stood together, there was no force in the universe that could stand against us. Something told me that the Battle of Zephyrus, as pivotal as it had been, was only the beginning, that there were more challenges to come, more enemies to face, and that humanity, for better or worse, would be at the forefront of those battles. The thought filled me with a sense of grim determination. We had won this fight, but the war was just getting started. Paul's eyes are haunted as he recounts the fierce battle inside the Cranax cloning facility. The alarm started blaring the moment we took down that suspicious officer. Suddenly, The narrow corridors were filled with the sound of pounding boots and angry shouts. The Cranach security forces were onto us. Paul's voice grows strained as he describes the desperate struggle. We lost Jax first. A Cranach's grenade took him out. Then Remy, cut down by a plasma bolt to the chest. But we couldn't stop, couldn't mourn. We had to keep moving, keep fighting. His fist clenches, knuckles white. It was brutal close-quarters combat, the kind where you can see the whites of your enemy's eyes. We had to claw our way through, one blood-soaked corridor at a time, planting explosives as we went. Paul's gaze grows distant, as if he's back in those hellish hallways. The Cranachs just kept coming. It seemed like for every one we put down, 2 more took its place. But we were driven by a grim determination. We knew that if we failed, if we let the Cranachs keep that cloning facility, they'd never stop. They'd keep churning out soldiers until they'd crushed every last pocket of resistance. He leans forward, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. Finally, after what felt like an eternity in those blood-slick corridors, we reached the main cloning chamber, and the sight of it, I still see it in my nightmares. Paul's eyes are haunted as he describes the horrific scene. Row after row of cloning tanks, each one holding a half-formed Cranach's warrior. Some were still just embryos, floating in the nutrient-rich fluid. Others were almost fully grown, their features twisted and grotesque. He shudders, the memory still vivid. It was like looking into the jaws of some monstrous machine, one designed to chew up entire worlds and spit out only death and destruction, and the scale of it. There must have been thousands of tanks in that cavernous chamber. Paul falls silent for a moment, his gaze unfocused. When he speaks again, his voice is heavy with the weight of what they had to do. We knew what we had to do. We set the final charges, right in the heart of that nightmarish place, and then we ran like hell. He closes his eyes, as if he can still feel the heat of the explosion on his back. The whole place went up like a supernova. The ground shook beneath our feet as we sprinted for the Invictus, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame. Paul's voice is raw with emotion as he recounts their desperate escape. We barely made it out. The Invictus was already lifting off when we threw ourselves through the airlock. I can still remember the smell of my own singed hair as the hatch slammed shut behind us. Paul's voice cracks with emotion as he recounts Jensen's sacrifice. The explosion rocked the Invictus, nearly knocking us off our feet. But it did the job. The Cranach's warrior was reduced to a smouldering pile of flesh and metal. He shakes his head, the pain of the loss etched on his face. Jensen was a hero. He gave his life to save ours, to ensure the mission's success. We wouldn't have made it out of there without him. Paul takes a moment to compose himself before continuing. We sealed the breach and gunned the engines. The Invictus tore out of the hangar bay just as the first explosion started to rip through the facility. His eyes are distant, as if he's reliving the moment. We could feel the shock waves even from orbit. The base collapsed in on itself, consumed by a roiling fireball that seemed to engulf half the planet. It was like watching the birth and death of a star all at once. Paul's voice is heavy with the weight of the memory. We'd done it. We'd struck a crippling blow to the Cranach's war machine. But the cost was high. He looks down at his hands as if he can still see the blood of his fallen comrades. We lost so many good people in that hellish place. Jensen, Remy, Jax. They gave everything to ensure our victory. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten. Paul falls silent, the weight of the past hanging heavy in the air. Corvus, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and sorrow, reaches out and places a comforting hand on the old soldier's shoulder. In that moment, no words are needed. The shared understanding of the price of victory, the burden of survival, passes between them like a silent current. Paul takes a deep breath, seeming to draw strength from the young Talarian's gesture. When he speaks again, his voice is steady, filled with a quiet determination. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The destruction of the cloning facility turned the tide of the war. Without their endless supply of soldiers, the Cranach's advance faltered. It gave us the breathing room we needed to regroup, to shore up our defenses and go on the offensive. He leans forward, his eyes locking with Corvus's. "That's the lesson of Zephyrus, lad. In war, victory often comes at a terrible price, but we pay it, because the alternative is unthinkable. We fight, we bleed, we die, so that others might live free." Paul sits back, his gaze turning inward. The Battle of Zephyrus was a turning point, not just in the war but in the history of the galaxy. It showed that the Cranax, for all their strength and savagery, were not invincible. That when the free peoples of the universe stand together, there is no force that can stand against us. His voice takes on a note of grim warning, but it also showed the lengths to which the Cranax would go to achieve their aims. The horrors we found in that base, they still haunt my dreams, and I fear they were only a taste of what the Cranax are truly capable of. Paul shakes his head, as if trying to dislodge the dark thoughts. But that's a story for another time. The point is, the Battle of Zephyrus taught us the true cost of freedom, and the importance of being ready to pay it, no matter how high it might be. Paul's voice grows heavy as he recounts the harrowing escape from the Cranax base. The Invictus shuddered and groaned as we pushed her engines to the limit. The shock wave from the explosion was right on our tail, a roiling storm of fire and debris that threatened to swallow us whole. He leans forward, his hands clenching into fists. We could feel the heat of it even through the hull. The ship's alarms were screaming, warning of imminent structural failure, but we couldn't slow down. To slow down was to die. Paul closes his eyes, as if reliving the moment. And then, just when it seemed like the Invictus would shake herself apart, we broke free. The shock wave dissipated behind us, and we were left in the eerie silence of space. He opens his eyes, a flicker of triumph in their depths. For a moment no one spoke. We were all too stunned, too drained by what we'd just been through. And then, as if on cue, the comms erupted with cheers, whoops of joy and relief from every ship in the fleet. Paul sits back, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. It was a moment I'll never forget. The realization that we'd done it, that we'd struck a blow against the Cranax that they wouldn't soon recover from. It was a victory that belonged to all of us, human and Talarian alike. But the smile fades as he continues. Of course we knew it wasn't over. The destruction of the cloning facility was a major setback for the Cranax, but it wasn't a knockout punch. They were too strong, too entrenched for that. Paul's gaze grows distant, as if he's looking out at a horizon only he can see. The war ground on, month after bloody month. The Cranax dug in their heels, turning every system into a fortress. They made us pay for every inch of space in blood and fire. He shakes his head, the toll of those long months etched in the lines of his face. We lost so many. Good ships, good crews. Entire planets were left in ruins, their populations scattered or wiped out entirely. There were times when it seemed like the fighting would never end, like we were trapped in an endless cycle of death and destruction. Paul's voice drops to a whisper, but we kept going. Through the pain, through the loss, through the bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting a war that seems to have no end, we kept going because we knew what we were fighting for. He looks up, his eyes locking with Corvus's. We were fighting for freedom, not just for ourselves, but for every species, every world that the Cranax threatened. We were fighting for the right to live our lives without fear, without the shadow of tyranny hanging over us. Paul's voice grows stronger, filled with a quiet conviction. And that knowledge, that sense of purpose, it kept us going. It kept us united. Humans, Talarians, Zoraxians, a dozen other species, we all bled together, fought together, died together. He leans forward, his words intense. Because in the end, that's what it takes to win a war like this. Unity, sacrifice, the willingness to stand together against the darkness, no matter the cost. That's the lesson of Zephyrus, Corvus. That's what I want you to remember. Paul sits back, his story finished for now. But there's a gleam in his eye that suggests there's more to tell, more battles to recount, more lessons to impart. The war against the Cranax may have reached a turning point, but it was far from over, and humanity, for better or worse, would be at the heart of the conflict to come. Paul's gaze grows distant as he recalls the final assault on Kronos. We knew it was going to be hell. The Kranax had turned their home system into a fortress with layer upon layer of defenses, minefields, gun platforms, swarms of fighter craft. They were determined to make us bleed for every inch of space. He shakes his head, a grim smile on his face. But we had a few tricks up our sleeves. The Talarians had managed to cloak a small fleet of their fastest, most maneuverable ships. They would be our ticket in, our chance to bypass the worst of the defenses and get our strike team to the surface. Paul's expression hardens as he describes the infiltration. It was a rough ride. Even with the cloaking devices, we couldn't avoid all the fire. The Kranax had so many ships, so many guns, that they filled space with a constant barrage. Our pilot, a Talarian named Zephyr, had to pull off some incredible maneuvers to get us through. He closes his eyes, the memory of the descent vivid in his mind. When we hit the atmosphere, it was like diving into the maw of hell itself. The sky was black with ash and smoke, lit by the constant flash of explosions and energy weapons. The Kranax had turned the very air into a weapon, filling it with toxins and corrosives that ate away at our ship's hulls. Paul's voice drops to a whisper. We lost 2 ships on the way down. They just disintegrated, torn apart by the Kranax's defenses. But we pushed on, knowing that every second counted, that every moment we delayed, more lives were lost across the galaxy. He opens his eyes, fixing Corvus with an intense stare. When we finally touched down, it was like stepping into a nightmare. The ground was a blasted wasteland, littered with the wreckage of ships and the bodies of the fallen. And everywhere the Kranax were waiting for us. Paul's fists clench as he describes the battle. They came at us in waves, a never-ending tide of clone warriors and genetically engineered monstrosities, things that defied description, that seemed to violate the very laws of nature. We fought them with everything we had, blasters and blades, fists and fury. He shakes his head, the toll of the fight evident in his eyes. We lost so many in those first few minutes, good soldiers, friends, torn apart by claws and fangs and weapons that seemed to defy reason. But we pushed on, carving a path through the horrors, driven by the knowledge that we couldn't fail, that the fate of the galaxy rested on our shoulders. Paul's voice takes on a note of grim determination. Inch by bloody inch, we fought our way towards the heart of the Kranax's defenses, the place where we would plant the graviton bomb. Every step was bought with blood and pain, every corridor a gauntlet of death and horror. He pauses, the weight of the memory heavy in the air. When we finally reached the chamber, it was almost anticlimactic. Just a small room, unremarkable except for the pulsing mass of technology at its center. The device that controlled the Kranax's defenses, their cloning facilities, their very hold on Kronos. Paul's voice is barely a whisper now. We set the charges, knowing that we were signing our own death warrants, that there would be no escape, no chance of survival. But we did it anyway, because we knew it was the only way to end the war. The only way to ensure a future free from the Kranax's tyranny. He closes his eyes, a single tear tracing down his cheek. When the bomb detonated, it was like the birth of a new star, a blinding flash of light that seemed to consume everything, to devour the very fabric of reality itself. We felt the shockwave, even through the layers of rock and metal, a force that shook us to our very bones. Paul opens his eyes, his gaze haunted. And then, silence. A stillness so profound that it seemed to echo through the very void of space. In that moment we knew it was over, that the Kranax, for all their power and cruelty, had finally been defeated. He leans back, a look of exhaustion and grief etched on his features. But the cost, Corvus, the cost was so high. So many lives lost, so much destruction wrought. Even now, decades later, the scars of that war still linger. The wounds it left on our souls, on the very fabric of the galaxy. Paul falls silent, his tale coming to an end. But there's a weight to his silence, a sense of unspoken pain and loss that hangs in the air. It's clear that for all the years that have passed, the memories of Kronos, of the sacrifices made and the horrors witnessed, still haunt him. Paul's voice is heavy with emotion as he recounts the final moments of the war. The graviton bomb worked just as it was designed to. Kronos' star collapsed in on itself, creating a black hole that swallowed the entire system. In an instant, the Cranax were gone, their empire erased from the galaxy as if it had never existed. He closes his eyes, the memory of that moment still vivid in his mind. The sight of the Cranax homeworld being consumed by the ravenous maw of the singularity, the utter silence that followed, as an entire civilization was wiped from existence. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of profound horror. Found. But our victory came at a terrible cost, Paul continues, his voice cracking under the weight of the loss. The gravitational shockwave from the bomb's detonation rippled out across the galaxy, causing untold devastation. Entire worlds were shattered, their populations wiped out in seconds. He describes the reports that flooded in, each one more horrific than the last. Planets torn apart by the gravitational upheaval, their surfaces cracked and molten. Colonies, outposts and space stations crushed into oblivion by the distortion of space-time itself. The death toll was staggering, the scale of the destruction beyond comprehension. He paints a picture of a galaxy in chaos, trade routes disrupted, communications silenced, entire sectors cut off from one another. A pall of darkness and isolation as the light of countless civilizations was snuffed out in an instant. "We had won, but at what price?" Paul asks, his voice barely a whisper. "Billions of lives lost, entire civilizations erased from existence. And for what? To stop a threat that we ourselves had created?" He shakes his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. The irony was not lost on him. In their desperation to defeat the Cranax, to end their reign of terror, humanity had unleashed a weapon of unimaginable destructive power, a weapon that, in the end, had made them no better than the monsters they sought to destroy. "In the end, we were no better than the Cranax," Paul admits, his voice heavy with shame and regret. "We had become the very thing we sought to destroy, a force of destruction and death on an unimaginable scale." He falls silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Corvus, his eyes wide with horror and understanding, can only nod in silent agreement. The young Talarian soldier seems to shrink in on himself, the enormity of the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. The two sit in silence, the weight of the past hanging heavy in the air. The din of the bar seems to fade away, the chatter of patrons and the clink of glasses becoming distant and muted. In that moment, there is only the truth of what had been done, the terrible price that had been paid for victory. Finally, Paul speaks, his voice barely above a whisper. "We won the war, but we lost our humanity in the process, and that, young Corvus, is a lesson that we must never forget." He leans forward, his eyes boring into Corvus's with an intensity that is almost painful. "For if we do, if we allow ourselves to become the monsters we fight against, then all the sacrifices, all the lives lost, will have been for nothing." Paul's words hang in the air, a solemn warning and a grim reminder of the responsibility that comes with power, the responsibility to wield it wisely, to remember the cost of its use, and to never, ever let the ends justify the means. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.